In this video, we'll build out this landing page in Webflow. I'll leave a link to the files in the description below if you'd like to follow along. Let's get started. In Figma, let's deselect everything. We'll open our variables, and from here, we'll open this side panel, and then we'll open our swatch collection. Let's copy this dark swatch, and in Webflow, we'll open variables. We'll go to the default collection, and under swatches, let's paste in this dark swatch. The light one will stay white, but we also have this brand swatch. Let's copy it and paste it in here. And anytime we're using text on top of this green background, we'll have dark text here. We're using a variable so that if we change this brand to say blue in the future, we could update this to white text or whatever we need for proper contrast. Now from here, let's head over to our theme collection, and we'll notice that our site is designed with a light background and dark text, but in dark mode, it's a dark background with green text. So we'll go ahead and set that inside light mode, light background, dark text, inside dark mode, dark background, and we'll have green text. Now we do have a secondary text color, and inside light mode, that'll be green, but inside of dark mode, it'll change to white. So we'll go ahead and add in a color variable here. We'll call this text2. We'll put it right under the main one, and we'll go ahead and connect this to the swatch brand inside of light mode, and inside dark mode, it'll be swatch light. Now our solid button hasn't really changed, so it's going to be green and hovers dark, and then inside dark mode it's green and hovers white, which is what it's already doing right here. Now the outlined button is a little bit different. So inside of dark mode, it's got a green border with green text, and it's going to hover green. So inside of dark mode, let's take our border color for our outline button and switch it over to green. Let's switch its text color over to green. And on hover, we're going to switch its background to green. We'll switch its border to green, and its text color is going to be brand text. So now that we have that, inside of light mode, the outlined button is going to have a green border with dark text, and it'll hover green. So we'll switch our border here over to brand. We'll switch our text still at dark. Our background hover is going to switch to brand. Our border hover switches to brand, and our text switches to brand text. And once we have that set, we can just head over to our style guide. And if we scroll down this, we can look at our button example. So here we have our outlined buttons and our solid buttons working just as we need. Next, let's set up our type. Under variables, we'll head to typography. And for the primary family, this is for our body copy. We'll use General Sans. The weight I uploaded for that was 500. We'll go ahead and remove the other ones, and we'll go ahead and create another family. We'll call this our secondary family, and we'll set this to the heading family. Now, because it's so bold, we'll change our letter spacing over to -1% instead of -3%, and I have that set here. And we'll also go ahead and upload a number for its weight, and this is secondary regular. The weight used on this was 400. And we'll go ahead and upload the trim top and trim bottoms for this new family. So this is a size variable, and we'll call it trim top, and we'll create another size variable, and we'll call it secondary trim bottom. Now, what this trim lets us do is have the text box hug the actual content. So without trim, you'll notice even though we have even spacing here, the paragraph feels closer to the button than it does to the heading. The top padding on our card feels larger than the bottom padding, and the top of this text isn't aligning with the top of the image. Now, as soon as we turn on trim, all of our spacing is more consistent, our alignment's more consistent, but we had to use larger spacing values here than what we're used to. So it's important to start with the trim in the design phase. So under type settings here in Figma, we can go ahead and turn the trim on like so. This is coming natively to CSS. It's already supported in the latest version of Safari and Chrome. But for now, while we wait for a browser to support to improve, we'll use manual trimming instead of this automatic trim. Now to do that, I've created this tool here that I'll upload in the description of the video. Let's go ahead and set a font family here. And this lets us preview how much trim we need off the top and bottom. We want to trim to the top of the capital letter and then crop off the descenders here. So I'll go ahead and copy this, and we'll head back over to Webflow, and we'll paste this in as our trim top. If we had multiple weights for this family, they could all share the same trim top and bottom, but each unique family needs its own trim values. So we'll paste that in here, and then we'll go ahead and figure out what the trim needs to be for our next family. which is going to be this one here. We'll go ahead and maybe loosen this up like so. And we can just go ahead and copy this and we'll paste it in here using EM. And these two share the same top, so we'll go ahead and paste that in here. So now that we have that set, we can head to text styles and start setting all of our headings here. So I'll click reset here to go back to the main weight, and we'll set this over to the secondary weight for the secondary family. And we'll set the family over to the secondary family as well on our display here. We'll set its trim top over to the secondary trim top and its trim bottom over to secondary trim bottom. So these are the trim values for this family. And we also want it to be uppercase because right now this is not all caps. So we'll head back under type or text styles and we'll go ahead and set this to uppercase. And then I'll just repeat these values across the H1 through H6. Now this site happened to be designed at 1560 pixels wide. So if we divide that by 16, that's 97.5 rem. So in Webflow, we can head over to our variables under default. We'll set our site width over to 97.5 rem. Now our site margin is the left and right space on our site, and this is set to 0. That means it's fluid. It's being overridden with custom code. So we can head over to our Fluid Builder app. And if you don't have that already, you can install it under apps here. And we'll just go ahead and launch it here. And we'll first of all change our site width, which is right here, over to 1560 so that all our fluid sizes stop scaling up at 1560. And then our site margin, that's that left and right padding. In Figma, it was set to 56 pixels. So we'll go ahead and set it to 56 pixels here on desktop, and it'll scale down to 16 pixels or 1 rem on mobile. And that's really all we need to set up our style guide. So on our home page, let's delete this placeholder hero section. Inside the page wrap for now, let's add a section and we'll give it the class of hero underscore main underscore wrap since it's the main hero section used throughout our site. If you have the FinSuite Chrome extension under folders, we'll see all our class names are being organized. In the hero folder, these are all the different types of hero sections on the site. Within that, we have all the different elements belonging to this type of section. And this is helpful because when we search for a class like hero underscore, it shows all the different types of heroes. Then we can filter down to a certain type of section. And within that, we have the elements belonging to that section. So for now, let's go ahead and drop in a section space component. I'll hit Command D to duplicate. This allows us to adjust the top and bottom space independently from component fields. In between those, we'll add a div, and I recommend adding the Lumos Chrome extension linked below for you to follow along. With that extension, if we hit the right arrow key, it returns the class name of the parent, and from there we can just add the element name, contain in this case, and on that we're going to add a utility of container small, so it takes up 10 of those 12 columns. And we'll notice this is doing the same thing in our design. Within that, we have an even split. So this is taking up 5 of the 10 and the visual is taking up the other 5. So within the contain, let's just add a div. We'll give it the class of layout and we'll give it a utility of autofit grid. So with autofit, it just takes up it creates even columns based on the number of divs we have. So if we have 3 divs here, we have 3 even columns. If we have 2, we just have 2 columns here. So on this div, let's give it a class of content. And within that, let's add our heading component. If I hit the up arrow key, it'll jump to the last item in the list. And I'll also add the paragraph component. And we'll also add the button group. And within that button group, let's go ahead and add the main button like so. Now inside the layout, we'll add a div for our visual. Usually I would give this a class of hero main visual, but because it's going to have other elements inside like this SVG, we need to make it its own subcomponent. So we'll call this visual wrap, and it's going to have an aspect ratio. The size of this div is 5.94 by 6.13. So we'll go ahead and give this a custom ratio, and this will be 5.94 and by 6.13. And once we have that set, what we'll notice on larger screens here is we want this content to be centered next to that visual. And one way we could do that is with Flexbox, but we'll notice whenever we apply Flexbox, there's much more space between the button and paragraph here. And that's because this button has some top margin, the button group, and the paragraph has some bottom margin, so it separates itself from other elements. And whenever we have margins, they usually overlap each other. But whenever their parent is set to flex or grid, the margins no longer overlap. So we could just clear out those margins and use gap, but because we're going for a certain spacing between each element here, what we'll do instead is, instead of applying flex to a parent of margins, we can just align the whole div to the center, and that just puts the whole thing in the middle. Now this is being done on the ID level. We want it to be saved on the class. So we can use an align self of center, and that'll just do the same thing, put it right there in the middle like so. Now in some instances of this component, we might decide to hide the button group if we have no buttons we want to show. And what we'll notice is we're seeing that bottom margin on the paragraphs here. So to fix that, we can just apply a margin trim utility on this content div, and it'll trim off the bottom margin from the last child and the top margin from the first child. And that way, no matter what we have in here, we never have to worry about those margins sort of overflowing. Now, inside of this visual wrap, we're going to have an image that's going to be much wider than its container div. So to figure that out in percents, we take the width of the child, divide it by the width of the parent, which the width of the parent is smaller. It's 594 in this case. So if I say divided by 594 and then times 100, the width of this image is 251% of the width of its parent. So we'll go ahead and add an image in here. We'll give it the class of image, and let's give it a width of 251%. And we need to set its max width to none. Let's go ahead and choose our image here. And let's go ahead and set this parent here to position relative. And we'll set the image to position absolute. And we'll anchor it to the bottom left corner of its parent like so. And then we'll apply a transform. And we'll move this with percent, which is a percent of the image's width like so. And we'll move it down using percent, which is a percent of the image's height. And we're just trying to get this to line up. So we want it, the top of it, to barely peek over the top of the bounding box. And then it's pretty much centered within that bounding box like so. And then what we can do is go ahead and copy this SVG. So I'll right click, copy as SVG. And we'll go ahead and launch the SVG import app. And from here, we want to make sure it doesn't create it as a component. We want it to use the current colors so we can control it from font color. And then we'll click in this box and just hit paste. And so once we have that SVG, we'll go ahead and drag it up here. We'll give it the class of hero main visual SVG. Let's go ahead and give it a position of absolute, and we'll absolute to the bottom of its parent. And let's go ahead and apply a transform here, and we'll move it up using percent. And we want it to kind of barely peek over the top of that bounding box like so, just like it was doing in the design. Now, regardless of the theme of this section, we want the SVG to always be green. So it's not necessarily matching the font color of the section. It's just always green regardless of the theme. So we'll go ahead and set this SVG's sort of font color here over to our swatch brands like so. And that connects it. And then what we'll notice on shorter screen heights here is we'll notice that this bounding box here isn't the full height of the content next to it. So we'll especially notice it here where we really want this pushed down. Now to do that, we would usually just give this a height of 100%. But because it has this aspect ratio here, it's going to try and maintain that ratio for as long as possible, and it just overflows. So we also want to give it a width of 100%, and that way it's completely contained. And we want to apply those two styles on the desktop breakpoint. Now, we might want this to wrap a little bit sooner than what it's doing now because this visual is feeling a little small. So to do that, we can go to our layout, and here on the desktop breakpoint, we'll go ahead and determine what we want the minimum size of our columns to be. Right now, they're 13 rem. Let's switch that over to 22 rem. And that'll just, the columns will wrap before they get smaller than 22 rem. So that's somewhere halfway through the tablet breakpoint. So this gives us a lot of control. And one other thing we want to do is make sure the top of the bird isn't so close. So we want to set our row gap. And to do that, we can just do a gap row, and let's do 8, and that pushes him a little bit further like so. And then one other thing we might want is to make sure that this visual doesn't get too wide, because here it's really, really large. So let's just go ahead and give it a max width. I'll do 22 rem for now, and then we'll do margin auto left and right to center it within the available space. I might increase that max width some. Let's go 28. And so what we should notice is when it wraps, now that image isn't super wide anymore, and it'll still shrink down on smaller screen sizes like we want. Now for the whole section, we'll want to make sure we set the section to overflow hidden, and that way it just crops off the branch that's hanging outside of it. We'll give it a min height of 100 SVH, and we want to center this content within the section. So let's apply a vertical flex and we'll go center, and that just puts this whole container right in the middle. Let's go ahead and change out some of our content. So I'll go ahead and select this hero sort of heading here, and we'll throw that in here. Now it's kind of hard to select this content because of this image. So I'll set the image to pointer events none, and that way it's not getting in the way anymore. And we'll go ahead and do the same thing here. Let's select this. Let's go ahead and paste this in. Let's copy our button text like so. We'll go ahead and paste that in. Let's edit our main button component, and let's go ahead and set the radius on it here over to small, so it matches the design closer. And let's also go over to the whole section and give it a hue theme of dark to put the whole section in dark mode. And let's also just turn this whole section into a component. So it's going to go in our section folder. So it'll be section/hero/main, since it's our main hero section, and we'll group it in with our sections here. And so now we have this reusable section component. And because it's actually a section now, we can put it inside the page slot, which is where all of our sections go. It's tagged as main here. And we can decide if we want to link the image or the text up to component fields. So if the text in this section should be the same on every page it's used throughout the site, then we wouldn't link this up to component fields. If we want the client to be able to change this text and it be unique for each page, then we would link that up. So for this one, we'll leave it just the same on every page. But for this next section here, we'll go ahead and connect everything to fields. So for this next section, we duplicate the starter section full component. We never use this section directly. We just duplicate it to create new sections from it. That way we don't have to reset up all the component fields from scratch. So we'll call this our section offerings, and we'll go ahead and create, and we'll add that section to the page. Let's give it a class, and we'll give it a class of offerings wrap. And on the container, let's give that a class of offerings contain. And let's add back on that container utility. Inside that, we have our grid. We'll give it a class of offerings layout, and we'll add back on that auto fit grid. Now we're going to set the minimum size for these columns, and we're going to do something larger, like maybe 42 rem, and that'll make it wrap a lot sooner. But if we go to larger screens here, we'll notice it actually is side by side. So usually to do something like this, we'd have to add an extra large desktop breakpoint, but AutoFit grids give us a tremendous amount of control, and it's also better for accessibility because if the user increases their font size, the layout just wraps without anything changing here. So let's go ahead and add in a row gap of maybe 8 to space apart these rows here. And we'll keep the column gap as is, so that's good. And let's go ahead and select this content div. We'll give it a class of offerings content. We'll go ahead and add back on the align self of center. And let's add in that margin trim like before. And we'll go ahead and remove the elements we don't need. So we're not going to use an eyebrow in this case. We won't use this global visual since we'll have cards. Let's head to the whole section and delete the component fields for the elements we're not using, like the visual and eyebrow. Let's move the styles up to the top, and let's set up our theme variants. So we have these variants here, but no styles are applied to them. So on this section, we'll give it a background color of our theme background and text color of our theme text, but we're not actually going to apply a theme to it yet. That way it can inherit from the theme of the whole body. Now on our light variant, this is where we'll apply the light theme, and on the dark variant is where we want to set our dark theme. And what this allows us to do is we can apply a theme to the whole body, and any sections inside that are set to inherit will just receive from the theme of the body. But we can always override their theme to always be light or always be dark, regardless of what the body theme is if needed. Now that we have that set, let's head back into this component, or actually let's set up what our heading should look like. So we'll add in our global heading component, and whenever we have bold words in here, we want to change their color. So let's go ahead and unlink this component, and we'll select over a word here, and we'll go ahead and bold it. We'll select back onto the word, and we'll style all bold text when it's inside of this global heading. We'll set its color to text secondary, and we want to reset its weight. So we'll add font weight under custom properties here, and we'll set that to inherit, so it receives the weight of its parent. And so now on any of our global headings, we can bold a word to change its color. Let's edit this component and go into the defaults for our prop, and we'll edit the default heading text here. So we'll go ahead and copy this text here, and we'll paste it in. We want to make sure it's an H2 by default, and we'll select the words that we want to bold and just set that here. So now it's changing their color there. And we can also select our default paragraph text, and we'll go ahead and edit that right here. So whenever the client adds in this component, this will be the default text used for it. And we'll do the same thing for the buttons here. So the client can always override it if they need a different button on a different page. But if they just use these defaults here, then if we ever need to change this default text or default link later, we can update it here, and it'll update for all the sections across the page that haven't been overridden. So now that we have that set, let's hop into the layout, and we'll drop in a slot. And this is going to be to hold these cards, so we can have a dynamic number of cards there. And we'll call this our offerings list, and we'll add in an auto fit sort of utility here. And we want this to have a tag of unordered list, but that's not an option here with slots. So what we can do is set the role to list for screen readers. And then let's add in a div that will act as our card. I'll put it above the list for now, and we'll call this our offerings card wrap. And if we head over to settings, we want its role to be list item, so that screen readers know this is an item of the list. And we'll go ahead and give it position relative, since it'll have absolute image inside. We'll give it overflow hidden and a border radius so that it crops the image to that radius. Let's go ahead and turn it into a component, and we'll call this offerings card. And inside of that, let's go ahead and add in our global visual component, which is just an absolute image or video that covers the whole parent. And we'll choose what we want the default image to be there. And let's also go ahead and drop in a div inside the card. We'll call this our offering card content. And we want to give it some padding. We'll go ahead and add space 5. I'll hold the shift key and click to apply across all sides. And let's also give it an aspect ratio here. We'll go custom. We'll go width of 2 and height of 2.2. And with the ratio, if we were to have lots of content inside here, or the font size was larger, it will just push the card to be taller when we have more content. So the ratio kind of acts like a min height there. Now you'll notice we can't see the content, and that's because it's static and the background image is absolute. So let's switch this over to relative, and now that is on top. So what we're going to put in here is actually an H3, since the main section is an H2 heading. And here we're using a plain text, not a rich text, so that we can link it up to a CMS name title field if needed. We'll go ahead and call this our card title, and we'll give it an H4 style. And because it's on a background image, we want the card to always have a theme of dark, regardless of the section's theme. Now inside that, let's add a global paragraph component. We're using rich text here so we can bold or italicize words. And I'll go ahead and select the whole content. Let's apply flex to align to the bottom. And we'll also throw in a gap. We'll go space 3. And we want to make sure this paragraph, we remove its bottom margin class. We could have added margin trim to the whole parent, but there's never going to be anything underneath this paragraph anyway. So that's good. Let's go ahead and copy it. Let's set the default text here. We'll go ahead and copy this and set the default text on this one here. And what we'll want to do is make sure that this heading is always wrapped on 2 lines. So we'll go to the base class, and for our max width, we'll go custom, and we'll set that to min-content, which makes it as wide as the longest word there. And one thing we might want to do is, if this card is ever shorter than the text next to it, this card would be stretched out to be a much taller height, but the content inside it is still anchored to the top. So what we want to do is just make sure that we're giving this card flex that kind of aligns it to the bottom. And that way that content is there. We can't put the ratio directly on this parent div, or we'd run into issues where the card doesn't grow when we have more content. So we're going to make sure that we have that set there. Now, one other thing we need to do is make sure that this is clickable. So we'll drop in our global clickable component. And this component gives us a lot of flexibility because we can disable it for cards that we don't want to be clickable. We can enable it, and it's either a link or an HTML button tag. So if we have this set to go to a page, it'll use the link tag. If we don't have it set, it'll use the button tag, which is what we need if this card were to open a modal or something. So we can use the same component in lots of ways. So there's some hidden text inside this component, and that's what screen readers read whenever we're focused on the link or the button tag. So we could say view the case study or whatever we want the action to be. In this case, though, I'm just going to connect the heading here to a field, and I'll call this something like heading. And for that link, I'll just go ahead and connect the text inside of that link to the same field so that when they focus on the link, it reads the title of the card. And I'll also connect the URL of this card to a field, and that way we can change that out on each card. And let's do the same for paragraph. We'll go ahead and connect that to a field here so we can change out its text. And for the image, we'll do the same. So we'll go ahead and connect that to a field here. This will be the image file, and create. And we'll do the same thing for the image's position in case we need to change that for each image we use. So if we head over to our props here, what we should notice, let's pull all of this out of global. For some reason it put it in the global folder, even though I removed it. We'll go ahead and keep the image and image file grouped together, and we'll just put that inside of image like so. And so now we can go ahead and close out of this. We'll delete this card from the main component and close the component. And then we'll paste the card into the list, and we'll go ahead and duplicate the card like so. And now we can change out the image we're using here. Let's go ahead and change out the title of this card. And let's also change out its paragraph text like so. So we have all that set. And one thing we might want to do is adjust the position of this image. So it could be 10% off the top or maybe 80% off the top. I'm going to do 100. I want it aligned to the bottom. And for this image, I might do something like 60. And if this image was wider, right now it's taking up the full width, but if it was wider, we could also adjust the left and right offset from here as well. So now that we have that set, this is looking pretty good responsively. But one thing we might run into is this heading here is starting to overflow out of the card. So we need to set the minimum size we'd want our cards to get. So if I select this card here, I might try something like a width of 17 rem, and that keeps the heading contained, but this paragraph is breaking onto 3 lines. I don't want it to get onto 3 lines. So I'll set the minimum size of the card to 20 rem, never get smaller than that. And where we want to set that is going to be on this list here. So if we open up this offerings list and we head over to that base class, we'll go ahead and set the minimum width of the cards to 20 rem. And so now we should have a fully responsive section where it kind of starts full, the cards stack under the title, and then eventually the cards stack under each other. And that's working quite well there. And it's responsive and good to go. Next, let's build out this CTA section. So in Webflow, we'll add in a section. We'll go ahead and add in a section space, and between those, we'll add a div. We're going to give this a class of CTA main because there's probably going to be other CTA sections throughout our site. This is just the main one. We'll have the contain in that with the container utility. Inside of that, we'll have a div called content, and we'll go ahead and give this some margin trim. And inside of that, we'll add in our global heading. We'll add our global paragraph. We'll add our button group, and inside that button group, we'll add the main button like so. And let's just copy over this content. So I'll paste that in here, and we'll go ahead and bold this word. We'll go ahead and copy over this paragraph here like so. And we'll also copy over the button text over here, and we'll paste that into this. We'll set our button over to the secondary style. And on the whole section, let's add an alignment of center, and that'll set our alignment mode. It'll also set our text alignment to that mode, so everything's linked up. And then under, or in our contain, under our content, we'll add a CTA main visual wrap. And we'll go ahead and give this a max width of column 6. So it's the width of 6 columns. And we'll give it margin auto, left and right to center it. Let's give it some margin top here of something like space 8 to space it apart. And inside of here, well, let's set it to position relative. Then inside of there, we'll add in an image, and we'll give it the class of visual image. We'll go ahead and choose our main image from here. And once we have that set, we want to make sure that this is a width of 154% of its parent with no max width. And we want to make sure that it's position absolute so it doesn't affect the height of the aspect ratio parent. And we want to make sure that we have the aspect ratio here on that parent. So that ratio is going to be 7.16 by 3.88. So we'll head to custom and we'll do 7.86, 3.88, something like that. And we'll go ahead on this image and we'll apply a transform. We'll move it using percent, and we just want to align it up within the space here, something like that. And we'll move it up using percent. And again, we're lining it up within this space, making sure it fits within, and that's good. And then let's also go ahead and add in our SVG. So if I were to just copy this SVG, and let's go ahead and drop in using SVG import. We want to make sure we're not creating a component here. We connect its fill and stroke to current color, and we just paste in that SVG like so. And once we have that set, we'll call this our visual SVG. And just like the hero, we want to set its color over here to the always be the brand color. And we'll also just throw on a transform. Let's move it up by a percentage to get it to line up kind of where we want. Something like that's good. And that's looking pretty good here. Now, one thing we might run into is this is getting really small. So usually on a certain breakpoint, I would just take the visual and I would remove its max width or set its max width to 100%. And that way it just fills up all the space. But here I'm trying to avoid using breakpoints entirely for this build. So that way when the user increases their font size, it'll eventually just show us exactly what we'd see on mobile. So it's breakpointless. It works just like browser zoom. Now to make that happen here, what we'll need to do is switch this over to custom. So we have our column with 6 variable is what we're using, but we can pass in max and then we can compare 2 values. In this case, I'm going to use the column width 6 variable that we've been using, comma, and we'll compare that to maybe 40 rem. We might tweak this. So max just looks at these 2 values and it uses whichever one's larger at the time. So by default, column with 6 will be larger, so that's what it'll use. But on mobile, 40 rem becomes much larger than column with 6, and it'll use 40 rem for our max width or whatever value we choose there. And so 40 actually might even be too large. Let's see what it looks like with 10. So if we head back over here, we'll go a little bit larger than 10. Let's go 25 and see what that does. So it's staying like our 6 columns here on desktop. It's mostly staying like 6 columns on tablet, but at a certain point on tablet, it starts to kind of overflow here because 25 rem becomes more than the 6 columns. And eventually here, it just is the width of the whole screen like so. And so that's good to go. So now we have this working completely without breakpoints. And if we zoom in enough, we'll see the mobile design filling this current viewport, and everything's good to go. Next, let's build out this featured CTA. So in Webflow, we'll go ahead and drop in a section. We'll add in our section space here, and we'll go ahead and add a div in, and we'll give this a class of CTA featured wrap. And inside of that, we'll have our CTA featured contain, and we'll go ahead and add on the container class. And inside of that, let's go ahead and add in our global heading. Let's turn this whole section into a component. So we'll call this our section slash CTA slash featured, and that goes inside the section. And we'll go ahead, we name it this way so we can search section slash to see all of our sections, and then slash CTA to see all the CTA sections. So it makes it easy to find the one we need. Let's go ahead and add in a global visual inside the section. We'll put it underneath everything else, and we'll go ahead and set its image like so. And we'll want to make sure the whole section is always in dark mode. So we'll add a theme dark like so. And let's go ahead and select this heading here. We're going to remove its bottom margin class, so that can go away. And we'll go ahead and change its text style to display, so it's much larger. Let's go ahead and copy this text, and we'll go ahead and paste that in. We'll go ahead and bold this word here. And inside the contain, let's go ahead and add in a div. We'll actually move the heading inside this. And let's call this our featured layout. And let's apply flex, anchored to the bottom, space between, allow wrapping. For our row gap or column gap, we'll actually use our site gutter. So it's the space between each of our columns. And then for our row gap, we'll actually use our space of 6. And let's actually drop in a div inside the layout. This will be our card wrap. And we'll give this a width of 100%, so it fills all the available space. And we'll give it a max width of column 3. So it's spanning 3 of those columns there. And we want to make sure that our heading here, we're going to give it a tighter max width. So if we look at our max width options, I'll go 10ch. And I'll also remove this uChild contain because that makes this parent full width and it centers the child inside of this, which is great when we're doing text align center and left for this. But here I want the element to actually be as wide as the max width. So we have that set. I'm going to set this card wrap to don't shrink or grow. And inside of that, we're going to add a visual element. And once we have that, the visual is absolute, so let's remove that position absolute. Let's give it an aspect ratio of 16:9 to match the design, and let's give it a radius of small, so it rounds off the edges. And let's also go ahead and choose an image here, and let's set the top position of that image to basically push it down a little bit more, maybe not that far, something like that's good. And we'll also want to make sure, so this should wrap whenever we run out of space for the heading and the image to stack side by side. They just stack under each other, but we'll run into the same problem where the image gets super tiny. So we can actually just solve that just like we did the image above. So we'll come over here, we'll do max, and we'll pass in our var of, we'll do column width of 3. And we'll compare that to another number, like maybe we'll say 15 rem. And so maybe a little less. Let's see, 10 rem might be okay. Yeah, and that way it just kind of stays this size all the way down until it reaches the maximum it can go. And doesn't look like it'll even reach it there. So that's good. So then from there, what we want to do is we want to add our text inside of this card. So this is actually going to be, let's actually turn it into a component just so it's sectioned off into its own thing. So this is going to be our CTA featured card. And inside of this card, we'll go ahead and have our a div to hold the content. And this can be card content. And we can have a text box. And this can be card title, like so. And let's grab our default title here. We'll copy that and we'll add it in here. And then let's also copy our SVG here, copy as SVG. And we'll go ahead and launch SVG import. And we'll go ahead and set the fills and strokes to the right color, paste that in. And we have this arrow here. Let's give it a CTA featured SVG, and we'll put it right in here so it's good to go. Let's give it a width, whatever size we want there, And then for this content, we're going to do flex and we'll space them apart. We'll set the SVG to don't shrink or grow so it doesn't get squished. We'll add a little bit of gap between this. So I might go with space 1. And let's add some top padding to this. Padding or margin would be fine. We'll go space 2, so that's good. And then inside of that, we'll just have our global clickable again. And we'll link that up to, let's connect this to the name of the card. So same way as before, we have our card's heading here. And we're connecting the link block inside of this, or the text, to that same heading. And then we would connect up the image and the URL and anything else we want to change. We could change that. So that's all connected there and responsive. Let's go ahead and give our section here on the base class a min height of 100 SVH. And let's do flex and let's align towards the bottom like so. And for our actual section space, I'm going to do something like small for the top and bottom of this. We don't actually need it to be that much, so that's good. And that pretty much wraps up this section. So for this footer, we'll go ahead into Webflow and drop in a section. And we'll change its tag here over to footer under settings. And then inside of that, let's go ahead and drop in a space. And we'll duplicate that. The top one we'll set to small. And the bottom one we'll set to even, so it matches the left and right space of the section. So that'll be even smaller. And we'll go ahead and add in a div. Let's give the section a class of footer wrap. Let's give the div a class of footer contain. Let's add on our container utility onto that. And inside of that, let's add a div called footer layout. And we're going to add an auto fit grid onto that. And let's add in some divs. So I'll just duplicate them. And let's call this second one our footer. We'll call it links wrap. And we'll go ahead and set that to an auto fit grid as well, because it'll have 2 columns inside. And for those columns, let's use list elements. And we'll give this a class of footer links column. And we'll give this item a class footer links item. And inside that, we'll have a text link. And this will be footer links link. And whenever we hover this link, we'll go ahead and set its text color over here to the second text color, like so, secondary color. And we'll go ahead and set this to an H4 sort of style here. Let's go ahead and delete these items so we can duplicate the first one. And on the columns, we're going to apply flex. And we'll go ahead and give this a gap of something like space 5 to space them apart. And let's duplicate the columns. So we have 2 columns here inside this auto fit grid. And let's go ahead and copy this text. And so we'll copy that over here and paste it in here. And here we'll go ahead and copy this. And we have reviews. And here we're going to have shop. And here we'll have Facebook, I think. And we'll have Instagram over here. And we'll have LinkedIn right here. So once we have those set, we can go ahead and add in our logo here. So we're going to have a link block, and we'll call this our footer logo wrap. And we'll go ahead and copy this SVG here. And let's go ahead and paste it in through SVG import. And this is going to be our footer. This will be our footer logo SVG. So we can just give it a class, footer logo SVG. I had it set to 55 pixels in Figma. So if I hit 55 space enter, it converts it over to RIM using the Chrome extension. So that's good. And then we'll also want the bottom of the footer. So if we come over here, this will be this logo here. We'll go ahead and copy it as an SVG. And we'll go ahead and paste it right into the contain. So we'll do SVG import. And let's go ahead and paste that in here. So we have that set now. And what we'll do is we'll give this a class. We'll call this something like footer word mark. And what we want to do is, first of all, we want the footer to be in dark mode. So let's give it that theme dark. And that's good there. On the base class, we want to give it a min height of 100 SVH. And we're actually going to apply flex like so. Now we need to distribute these things, but they're all inside the contain. So what we want to do here is with this contain selected, we want to set it to grow if possible. So it just fills all the remaining space of the section. Then we'll do flex and we'll go ahead and space between like so. And we'll also, just for safety, give it a gap to make sure that these two elements never run into each other. And we want to set a minimum column size here. And it looks like the minimum size I would want for these, if we were to type in a rim value, we probably want these links columns to never get smaller than 15 rim because here it's overflowing already. So on this whole auto fit grid, let's just go ahead and give it a minimum column size of 15, and that'll make it wrap there. Now, when it does wrap, we do want more gap between the two separate lists to show that they're different lists. So we'll go ahead and add a row gap here of something like space 7 seems okay there. So we have that set. And so now if we preview, we should notice this is fully responsive. It starts off with the two columns stacked next to each other there. But when we run out of space, it goes ahead and it wraps. And then when we run out of space again, somewhere there, it wraps. We'll want more gap there, so we can fix that. But other than that, it's looking pretty good. So that'll just be row gap, and that's row gap on this auto fit grid. So we'll just give it some row gap of 8. And that way, when this wraps under, we have some good space there. And we can just go ahead and turn our footer into a component. And I'll put it in section footer. And it could honestly be global footer because I usually put the nav and the footer in global since they're just not really sections. So that is the footer, and we're making sure it's outside of our page main. Lastly, let's set up our nav. I'll add a div and give it the tag of nav here. I'll move it above the page main and give it the class of nav wrap. And we'll give it some top and bottom padding of site margin so it matches the left and right space on our site. Inside of that, we'll add a div with the class of nav contain, and we'll add on our container utility, and we'll have a link block inside that with the class of nav logo wrap. And we'll give this a width of 180 pixels, which is roughly 11 rim. And inside that, let's go ahead and launch SVG import, and we'll go ahead and paste in our SVG logo here. And we might use this logo in other places throughout our site. So what I like to do is, first of all, give it a class of global SVG. That switches it to display block, so it removes that extra bottom space that comes with inline block. It also gives it 100% width and height. And now we can turn this into a component that we use in multiple places. So I might call this my logo here. And that way, if we ever need to change the logo in the future, we only update one component. Now we're also inside the contain, going to drop in a button. We'll switch it over to the secondary style, and let's just copy over this text from it like so. And on the whole contain, we'll go ahead and set on the base class a display flex, space between, and give it a gap. And on the whole nav wrap, we want to make sure that it's position absolute to cover everything. And we'll set the z-index higher so it's above everything else. Now, if we set our theme here over to dark, we'll notice the logo isn't actually changing here, and that's because we just need to reapply this theme text variable on the nav, so it's not inheriting the body text color. And we can actually just turn this into a component. I'll put this inside of global, and I'll call this nav, and we'll go ahead and do that here. Now, we want to be able to switch the theme of the nav, so our default theme here might be dark, but we might create another variant for light. And the reason is on other pages, we might decide to put the nav by default on top of a light section. So we'd want to be able to switch it back to light when needed. By default, though, I'll keep it dark for this build anyway. So now we have this lander completely built out and responsive in Webflow.